So welcome to another webinar from the CBI and Teams webinar series for 2022. And this is going to be a little bit different from what we've talked about in the past in terms of presenters today, but it's going to be quite interesting, I think. And so we're going to deviate slightly from our international models on emergency management we were discussing with national authorities and move over to the Counter Terrorism Preparedness Network with Alex, who's going to be joining us today to give us an overview of their work and what they focus on and some of the things, the great things that they've been doing and their focus areas. But before we get started, as we usually do, we've got a series of announcements to go through. And that includes, of course, a few quick points, which is let us know where you're from. Where are you joining us from? And where are you from different parts of the world? Just let us know directly in the chat. And of course, if you have questions during the webinar presentation today, simply use the Q&A feature. And you'll be able to sort of, of course, you'll be able to send questions to the panelists, and then we'll be able to answer them either by chat or we'll take them live towards the end of the presentation itself and answer the questions as best we can. Now, all of these recordings from 2021 and 2022 are actually uploaded on the Teams website and the CBI YouTube page as well. And this is actually our 5th webinar series of the year thus far. We're a little bit slower than we were last year, where we had, I think, 26 or so webinars that we had last year. We're in our 5th webinar so far today, and we're going to continue with those series throughout the year as well. And of course, if you haven't done so already, subscribe to the Crisis Conflict Emergency Management newsletter. That's what we produce from Capacity Building International. We send that out every month, and that includes webinars, includes also our various different announcements, jobs, and other things that go out to our community every single month. You can get that either through LinkedIn or you can get that through directly to your inbox by subscribing to our mail list itself. And it also includes our podcast. And so our podcast that we issue every month as well, where we do interviews with academics and practitioners in the field of crisis, conflict, and emergency management and discuss various different aspects such as recovery and other different aspects. Well, including we just had a podcast with former student of ours, who's now the emergency manager in the city called The Line, based in Neom, Saudi Arabia. So that was quite interesting to see what they're doing there. And of course, on August 29th, we're starting our last iteration, our last cohort this year with the NATO Crisis Management Disaster Response course. And that's hosted by CBI, done in partnership with the NATO Crisis Management Disaster Response Center of Excellence. And so by completing this course, you get 2 certificates, actually, one from CBI and another one from the NATO Center of Excellence. And if you've ever been interested in how the international community responds to crisis, and specifically how NATO responds to crisis, this is actually the course for you. 100% online, asynchronous, and we go through cohort models, and we go through that all together in the last 8 weeks. So if you're interested in that, you can just head over to capacitybuildingint.com and look there. Or you can simply just shoot me an email, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have. Now, getting through that, now I'm going to turn over to Harold, because I know there's probably at least one announcement coming up, especially with regards to the annual conference. And so, Harold, over to you.
Thank you, Kyle. And I also look forward to Alex's presentation today. I know I went to Alex's conference, or the CTPN conference in Stockholm, which was this spring. And it was some really interesting presentation. So I think we will enjoy this. And I also meet Alex, who is a member of our COSAC community, which is Community of Safe and Secure Cities, and where he is one of the experts we consult in the development of the Impetus project. So I think we will have a good presentation. But I'd like to make an announcement. As you said, I saw you had up the web page, Kyle, and that is the Teams annual conference 2022 is coming up. Here we see the announcement. It's at Kennesaw State University in Atlanta, Georgia, from 17th to 21st of October. And we have 54 submitted abstracts approved. So, and in addition to keynote speakers and welcome speakers, we will have more than 60 presentations over the week. And these comes from actually more than 30 countries. So it will be very international and a lot of interesting talks. In addition, on the Monday and Friday of the same week, we also run workshop on TQC and TQAC workshops. So you can go to Teams website and you find the details of what I just told you. But I believe at the end of this week or early next week, the registration site will be up and you can start registering to the conference. So I look forward for that. That was what my announcement is today, Kyle, and then I look forward for Alex.
Okay, thanks, Harold. And yes, definitely attend the conference. It's going to be quite interesting. It's going to be in hybrid format, as Harold was mentioning, and we're going to be streaming that and everything. Lots of presentations, and it's going to be, I think, a great event. So more information to come on that. Yes, thank you for the message about chat being disabled, and I think it's back up now. So thanks for that. It's always these small details that get us in the end, right? Okay. So now we'll just turn it over to Alex. So Alex, thanks for joining us today, and I very much look forward to the presentation.
Harold, Kyle, thank you very much for the warm welcome and introduction. Very pleased to be here. Alex Townsend-Drake, and I'm head of program for the Counter Terrorism Preparedness Network, CTPN for short. As I work through the presentation, please do think of any questions you may have. I'm happy to elaborate and take questions either during or at the end, however works best. But very keen to engage with you all at some point as well. So over the next kind of 30 to 40 minutes or so, I'm going to give an overview of CTPN, who we are and what we do, and how we operate. And then just go into a few details around some of the focus areas that we're currently interested in, to hopefully spark some dialogue and interest around those. Okay, so CTPN, we're a public sector-led international collaboration spanning Europe and North America and Australasia, with a focus on city preparedness. So that's protecting and preparing cities against acts of terrorism and building resilience in kind of a holistic way in order to achieve that. We work very closely with cities across that geographical footprint through our CTPN membership, but also with what we call strategic partners. That's partners from Europol, Interpol, the National Counter-Terrorism Security Office in the UK, the European Corporate Security Association, and others. Also working very closely with the United Nations and European Commission and NATO and so on. So a really good position in that respect, and we are the only international collaboration working with a focus on city preparedness against terrorism. Now, an interesting composition in terms of how we're made up and structured. My role is hosted by the London Fire Commissioner and a department called London Resilience Group, which is responsible for regional emergency planning within London and response to major incidents. But I'm actually funded currently by the City of Stockholm. So I have 2 lines of accountability in terms of delivering CTPN. What we do, there's 3 pillars to our program: research, events and projects. Our research, all our reports are available on the webpage, london.gov.uk/CTPN. The last one was actually on city preparedness for cyber-enabled terrorism. And the approach we take is fairly unique. So we bring together academic literature with official reports, then build in the knowledge and expertise of the CTPN membership to create that documentation that includes academic institutions and centres of excellence in relation to the field. And then prior to publication, we build in expertise from independent subject matter experts just to provide that extra critique and depth to our reports. And if you get a chance to have a look at those online, you'll see the focus of those reports is to table recommendations to the city authorities in relation to building resilience. Events, these range from international conferences. Harold mentioned our recent program in Stockholm, to bespoke seminars for CTPN members and scenario-based exercises. So the exercises include, for example, a forthcoming exercise with the United Nations focused on CBRN, threat training from the United States Secret Service, and others. So you get an idea of how they look. We average about 1 every 6 weeks in terms of that program. And then finally, projects. So these are projects which are either commissioned by the CTPN International Board or our strategic partners that relate to either reports recommendations, that's CTPN report recommendations, or emerging needs, or indeed projects that we otherwise support. So I met Harold through the European Consortium of Impetus, which is a good project looking at developing artificial intelligence tools for use in a city context. So a really good program taking place there, and we're pleased to be supporting that. So the reason we exist is because we believe terrorism is a global, networked and persistent threat that requires an integrated and holistic approach at all levels. Fundamental to that belief is the very fact that emergencies and incidents of all types happen first and foremost at the local level. That's no different from terrorist attacks. So actually building the security and developing the structures of cities, not only in terms of multi-agency arrangements, but in terms of the city's infrastructure and operations, is absolutely key if we are to be resilient. And that is our reason for existing. As I alluded to previously, you know, for us, we fill a niche around the multi-agency city preparedness, and that is the gap in which we dominate. And finally, before I move on to some more kind of thematic issues, just the structures around how we operate. So you can see at the top of that diagram there, we have the CTPN International Board. That is the senior leaders from all CTPN cities represented on that board, plus our strategic partners. And that's currently chaired by the City of Stockholm, their Deputy Chief Executive, whom I report into for the delivery of the network. And then underneath, you can see that there's 5 subgroups. We're going to introduce another on CBRN, and these are all thematic subgroups at more of a tactical level, where we're facilitating that exchange across CTPN member cities and partners. Now, these groups meet on an 8-week cycle, not only to exchange information, but also to discharge the CTPN work programme, which is agreed annually. Now, that programme at the moment is in full flow. So we are kind of halfway through, clearly, the 22-23 programme. But there's a few areas I'm going to delve into a bit deeper now, which are of particular interest to the group currently. So the 3 areas I'm going to discuss are unconventional threats, infrastructure, systems and services, and enhancing multi-agency coordination. So these are 3 areas that are of particular interest to us currently. Now, unconventional threats being notably cyber, the cyber threat that we currently face, but also CBRN, chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear threats are you know, very topical at the moment. And this is really due to 2 main pillars. Firstly, geopolitical drivers. So we're talking the fragility of politics globally, hostile state activity, the Afghanistan crisis, etc., as well as changes in terms of climate change and the drivers that's causing in terms of instability as well, because that actually has a knock-on effect in terms of conflict and the CT threat ultimately. But also rapid advances in science and technology. We all know that the advancements in science and technology are at such a pace that they're hard to keep up with in terms of building our resilience and our arrangements as organisations and as city authorities. And that is coupled with reduced barriers to access by malicious actors, again, which I'll come on to in more detail in just a moment. So to look at that to break that down, CBRN, the report prior, our 2021 report focused on the bioterrorism threat on the back of COVID-19. So we were looking at the risks that presented. And one of the quotes that we used in that report is on screen. The DNA strains used in the anthrax attacks, that's the anthrax attacks in the United States, cost several $1,000s and took 3 months to accomplish. Now, a typical microbiology researcher could do the same for approximately $200 in half a day. Now, that just shows, that is a case in point around how quickly, comparatively, that type of attack could be achieved at a very low cost. So for us, that unconventional space in terms of CBRN is something that we need to continuously consider around what that threat looks like and how it evolves. If we think about the cost of $200 to produce that type of attack, it's minimal. And if we think about how not only terrorist groups can actually access the education in order to be able to understand and learn how to conduct these types of attacks, they can also pay for it through the likes of the dark web, through crime as a service. So actually the barriers to access are much lower now than they have ever been. And then cyberspace. This quote is from the European Commission, a recent report on hybrid threats. And it says that cyberspace provides a new delivery mechanism that can increase the speed, diffusion, and power of an attack and ensure undetectability. So this is recognizing the threat that we are seeing on a daily basis globally, through, albeit low-level attacks, but the understanding is there that the attacks could be much more significant, especially if we think about if they were to be used against the power infrastructure of a city or a nation, for example, and the consequences and ripple effects that could have. Now, we realise that from a CT perspective, the threat in terms of cyber and CBRN is comparatively low. But what we are saying here is that over the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years, that threat is likely to increase because the cost barriers to access are reducing and accessibility to the means, modes and methods is increasing. Hence our interest in this area currently. And the infographic there on screen is just extracted from the cyber report that we produced. And you can see kind of how all these emerging and current threats are convening against, the considerations of external actors and internal threats within organisations and authorities themselves, which creates quite a broad and complex cyber attack surface. The second area I'm going to touch upon is infrastructure, systems and services. So this is acknowledging that actually cities and indeed nations are systems of systems. They're services upon services. They're complex networks of infrastructure. And the need to future-proof our cities has never been more urgent. Linking back to my previous point around advances in science and technology, actually cities are on a dangerous curve if we do not act, if we're not ahead of what is happening in that space. And there's twofold for us is this integrated approach around how we can better future-proof cities by integrating sectors and our approaches to planning and consequence management, but also consequence mapping. And this is an approach that we're trying to push through the CTPN events and exercises currently, which is where we think about a certain incident or attack happening and what the ripple effects of that could be. And then looking at what those consequences are and what needs to be done in order to try and mitigate them in the first place. So just to take that into a little bit more detail, the above quote at the top of the screen, again, is extracted from another CTPN report on protecting major events of crowded places. And it says that a useful way to understand risk is to consider it as a product of vulnerability. That is how susceptible a place or system is to attack. The threat, that's the likelihood and modes of attack, and criticality, so how serious the consequences could be. And this is the approach that we apply to consequence mapping. So we're thinking about, well, which locations are most vulnerable to an attack? What will that attack look like? And what will those consequences then be? In order to identify vulnerabilities and pinch points and inform the planning process. Now, what we're trying to do is build in a more holistic perspective into this, a longer term perspective. So building protective security into city development strategy. Now, protective security, for those of us who work in the CT security space, is something that is embedded into practices across most developed nations, at least. But it's not thought of enough in terms of the longer term and the challenges that it could be contending with 5, 10, 15 years down the line. So actually, when we're looking at regeneration and city development strategies, city resilience strategies, and at strategic level, protective security needs to be a core component of that, as does preparedness and resilience of city operations, which is bullet point 2. So how can we make sure we're really enhancing continuity and resilience of city operations as part of that regeneration city development strategy? And this is partly this is about thinking beyond security by design, but also thinking more broadly about how we can dilute the threat itself. So if we think of an urban environment, London, which is where I'm hosted, population circa 10 million people, some very dense city areas. Let's think of a transport hub as an example, where you've got a ticket barrier, and during rush hour you automatically have dense groups of people trying to move through, which in themselves become potential targets. If you're thinking from a terrorist perspective, how can we, by designing urban spaces more carefully, more cleverly, actually dilute that threat? And this could be through channeling the way people behave, think, interact, and respond to their environment, be that through signage and the clever channeling of movement through busy areas, to actually integrating smart technologies so that ticket barriers are needed and those pinch points are created. That does, of course, risk creating secondary problems whereby people are so free flowing it causes overcrowding in other locations. But that again is something that needs to be considered as part of that broader consequence mapping piece. So actually, how do we better design city spaces and utilize technology in such a way that we're diluting the threat and reducing the risk itself? Now, the picture you can see on the screen there is an illustration provided by University College London, and they've just finished constructing an excellent facility called PEARL, PEARL, in which they're able to reconstruct different environments, and the facility uses advanced technologies so that you can you can actually recreate sounds, smells, atmospheres in a very realistic way. And I've visited the facility, and it is impressive. So how can we utilize facilities like that, utilize academic expertise so that we can test our planning, our arrangements, our thoughts and processes prior to them actually being implemented in reality in urban spaces? So you can see here on the screen the illustration they've got is of a London Underground train, the platform. And what we would be able to do, hypothetically, is see what the difference is in terms of how people behave and react when there's an attack, and what difference it makes if there's barriers, if there's not barriers, if walkways are bigger or smaller or directions change. And this would inform the whole protective security and city development agenda. So it's just a nod really to the facilities that we can tap into in order to inform our thinking. And finally, it's just a recognition that the development of infrastructure and strategy that are future-proof does require cross-sector participation and private sector engagement. Private sector are absolutely key to developing these systems and services in a resilient and robust way. So, you know, that engagement is critical. Okay, so the last point I'm going to kind of delve into is the need to continue to enhance multi-agency coordination. The 2 bullet points below are both actually quotes from our strategic coordination report. The first one says, leadership is particularly important in crisis management to successfully navigate inherently unpredictable, complex and high impact situations. That increases when these fast time incidents like terrorist attacks, where decisions are under pressure and need to be made quick time. And the second bullet point is that partnership working is the bond that turns plans into practice. Plans are useless if they're not trained and tested on by multi-agency partners. So there are 2 key points which I'm going to kind of delve into a little more now. The diagram on screen is designed to illustrate the complexity of coordination. So I have an on-call role in London. I'm a strategic advisor for London Resilience Group. So if there's a major incident or regional incident and I'm on call, I'll be activated to support the coordination structures and advise the strategic coordinating group. Now, as you can see from the diagram there, and this is non-exhaustive, I should say, there's many more, there are other elements that could be activated, but you can see the complexity from the coordination in structures themselves to the need to warn and inform the public, scene management, investigations, managing fatalities and casualties, supporting survivors, engaging the community, recovery, scientific advice. There's a lot happening. And having been involved in the response to a number of terrorist attacks at a regional level and also the likes of the Grenfell Tower fire, when all these different components are activated, there's a lot happening. There's a lot that needs to be exchanged within and between agencies at operational, tactical and strategic levels, and indeed then passed up to central governments and back down. So the complexity is navigating that complexity is an ongoing challenge that we need to keep improving, no matter how good we think the structures are. One of the key challenges within this is something called the evidence gap. Now, the evidence gap in crisis management is known as the period of greatest uncertainty caused by insufficient, reliable and actionable information compared with demand. So this is where there's a real thirst for information, but operationally things are happening so quickly that we can't translate that into credible and verified information quick enough to inform decisions. And that can create a vacuum for multi-agency decision making and indeed multi-agency communications, and that's intensified in these types of cases. Now, the question here is how can we close the evidence gap? Now, training, exercising is an obvious one, and that is something that needs to continue being done. But a second question is around the use of technology and how technology can be better utilized to serve us in this respect through live feeds, through not only through operational live feeds, but actually live feeds through strategic meetings out to tactical meetings and so on, so that actions are being discharged more quickly, and co-location. So how can technology assist with co-location? So, you know, post-COVID, a number of strategic groups I've been involved in have met virtually, and it's working. Previously, we would always meet face-to-face. There's pros and cons to that. So how can we enhance technology but not lose the value of meeting face-to-face in order to close the gaps and the gaps that we may otherwise experience? So that for us is a key challenge that we are continuing to work on addressing. And partly this is, you know, through the refinement of strategic structures. So those of you involved in planning and response at a city level will be familiar with some degree of coordination structure, where you have a number of different subgroup and specialist groups in the bottom tier on here, so from multi-agency operations to public health, counter-terrorism and security, and so on. But with an overarching information data analysis cell, and then the strategic structures above, which feed up into our political and strategic leaders and have an outward-facing role into the media. Now, where we have this evidence gap, it's in that middle box, the information, data, collation, and analysis. So this is the cell where we need to make sure that the information being received is accurate and credible, so that it can be distilled to inform outward briefings and upwards briefings, which will in turn inform ongoing operations. And that is the big challenge. How can we do that quickly, effectively, and efficiently? And we make it work, but it could always be improved. So again, that just links back to the evidence gap on the previous slide. That's the gap between the green and the blue line, and how we can close that using co-location, but also better utilising technologies. So I'm going to conclude by just running through the components of city preparedness. Now, this is something that we pulled together as CTPN with a group of fellow authors and experts for one of our reports. And it's a very high level overview, but it's designed to demonstrate there's all these different points need to connect to achieve preparedness. Now, if city resilience is a goal, it's a desired end state, then preparedness is the ongoing means. It's what we need to be doing to try and maintain a state of resilience at all times. Now, if we look at top right, strategic leadership and legislation. So this is making sure that legislation is right to support what we need to do in the first place. Making sure that the acts and legislation underpin the duties of public bodies are appropriate, and that the strategic leadership matches that in terms of their knowledge, experience, training, and expertise. Bottom right, multi-agency capabilities. So ensuring that our blue light services, local authorities, health, all have appropriate capabilities, not only to deal with current priorities and challenges, but those that we might face in the future. And that requires investment, and it requires a willingness to accept the level of resources that we need to put in to these critical services. Bottom left, communications and behaviour. This is how we can best warn and inform the public. Communication influences behaviour, and behaviour influences communication. So how are we best informing our populations so they're as prepared as they can be and are aware of where their resources and services are? And the top left is recognising that this all differs depending on the social, cultural environment in which it sits, and that's important. Now, the inner circle, city systems, public health, security, infrastructure. These are all the things I've touched upon, albeit briefly, during this presentation. City systems are all those city operations that make a city function. We need to make sure we build in preparedness, resilience, and continuity into those systems, both now and for the challenges that we will face in the future. Infrastructure, the very environment in which cities are built upon and are being built, needs to make sure we include protective security, both for cyber threats and physical threats. And security itself, that is the surveillance of cities, not only in terms of the security services and law enforcement, but in terms of the CCTV network, how artificial intelligence can assist, but also how we're building in security measures to avoid malicious acts within the security systems themselves. And public health being an overarching component, especially in the back of COVID-19. We've seen how important public health is in terms of social and economic stability. And what we propose is that all these components need to come together to get a state of preparedness, and that preparedness will be different depending on how mature your city structures are at any given time. So that was a little bit of a whistle-stop tour, really, around who we are and what we do at CTPN, and some of the issues that we're currently considering, and our view of city preparedness. There's plenty of other materials available online. We've got a number of reports that can be downloaded. They're all free and accessible, and other information about the network online, so do take a look. But happy to elaborate or take questions. So Kyle, back to you.
Great. Thanks a lot, Alex. Very interesting presentation. We do have one question already, which is most of what you describe in terms of preparedness, response, recovery would apply pretty much to any kind of crisis event, not only to ones induced by terrorism. So is the scope of your work actually wider than specifically counterterrorism?
It's a very good question, because we absolutely apply a holistic approach to what we do intentionally, because we recognize that actually consequence-based plans and capabilities are the most effective way forward. So a lot of what we do is actually transferable to other risks or threats as well. We approach it from a CT angle because there are nuances, there are differences. There are sensitivities and political sensitivities as well. And attacks do invoke different structures and measures which we wouldn't necessarily see in other incidents. So our approach does come from a slightly different angle, but actually a lot of our outputs are transferable in their own rights.
Thanks for that. And there's actually, I read an article today, actually, which is interesting when you're talking about resilience. Maybe you can go back just a couple of slides to the circles and the overlay. But this article was focused on, yes, thank you, and specifically talking about, I think it's the UK's National Resilience Strategy, supposed to be coming out pretty soon, or at least the latest edition of it. And so in a sort of comparison and contrast between what's happening in Ukraine and then what the UK is doing, there's a unique perspective in terms of having what we might call, say, more developed, or at least more sustainable institutions, I would say, in terms of being able to provide for public safety, provide for public health, city systems, infrastructure. So those institutions being developed and being able to deliver those services, there's a direct correlation between, say, a degradation of the population and being resilient, right? So the better the institution, the less that the population feels that they need to be prepared. And then with the exact opposite. So a degrading institutional capability means that sort of responsibility shifts to a personal and individual preparedness level. And so this correlation is coming out in terms of what we're observing and happening in, what's happening in Ukraine, and in terms of what other nations are taking on board. And I would say also is largely true to what I've experienced in different conflict zones and environments. But when we're looking at sort of the overlay here of all these different dynamics and the coordination piece, which you're absolutely correct, is very complex at times and very bureaucratic, there's really two questions I'd like to focus on, really. One is, of course, obviously, the complexities of counterterrorism programs and terrorism in general, and the threat and the risks associated with that. But what are some of the main challenges in terms of trying to implement programs like these? So is it largely bureaucratic? Is it leadership level? Where are the challenges in trying to integrate these perspectives? And once we're done with that one, I'll ask another question after that.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think my initial reaction is the main challenge is that we have too much turnover at a political level. So what we need is stability, not turnover, because to implement programs, it requires stability if they're going to be successful, and it requires investment. Now, if there's changes in political priorities, political leadership, and the focus, shifts, then actually that can rock the boat, and we can end up, maybe not back at square one, but we might be back at square two, and we could be at square four. So for me, that's a big issue, and it's something that I've seen applied in multiple contexts. I mean, I did some work in East Timor a few years ago, towards the end of the United Nations peacekeeping mission, and the very point around stability, not turnover, was evident. in developing the society itself. And I think that absolutely applies here, because we are still looking to develop services, infrastructure, programs which can counter terrorism and build resilience, and that requires stability. So the lack of stability in that respect is, for me, the biggest challenge. Because just to conclude that, I suppose it's with the your point around bureaucracy is true and is fair. There are many layers that programs need to go through often, but that goes hand in glove with the stability around the process. If we have stability and processes are tried and tested for implementing these programs, then that becomes slightly easier. So I think the two are kind of hand in glove.
Thanks for that. And the follow-up question with that is really in terms of, okay, we have programs, we've created system structures and an environment to be able to deal with terrorist events. At what point are you recommending sort of that community engagement, down to the individual level in terms of that big? I know that you're focused more on that strategic level and larger programs being implemented, but when does the community get involved in these aspects? So
for CTPN ourselves as a body, we don't engage directly with community. So I'll just say that from the outset. But for our constituent partners and authorities will have their own ways and means of doing so. Now, my personal view, is that we should be engaging with communities at all stages. Obviously, depending on there's many different facets to engagement, because you've got the whole prevent side of things, where we're looking to prevent radicalization, extremism, and intercept. And that can not only be through, countering that, but also through the development of social programs, employment initiatives and education, and making sure that we take an inclusive and diverse approach towards the programs we're delivering. But also preparedness at a local level, in terms of from as simple as delivering first aid training, which we know that happens through a whole plethora of voluntary sector organisations and others, to more targeted training around CT. So in the UK, we've got the Action Prevents Terrorism programme, which has a number of different training modules attached to it. And they can be accessed by members of the community and small businesses and the like. So I think there's multiple strands that we need to be looking at. Again, to take that further, the Protect initiative. Yes, I've spoken about that fairly strategically, but if we think about small businesses, which may be run by one or two members of the community, they should be tapped into that agenda as well, because it might be a local pub that actually gets attacked. So that engagement needs to happen from the start, and it needs to happen throughout.
Okay, thanks. And so shifting slightly, when does the CTPN, do you provide any type of approval or certification of technologies that might be proposed as useful or being useful in supporting detection of response or threats?
No. We certainly don't position ourselves as approving those sorts of products. Our role is to support the development of those types of products where it's relevant for us and appropriate for us to do so, and to provide feedback. But it's not for us to approve. That would be for the authorities themselves who may be using such tools.
Okay. And that's also another question came up about the communities, but I think it follows a similar train of thought, which is you're providing recommendations by CTPN to communities and or to authorities, and then they have that ultimately that responsibility to prioritize and engage the communities accordingly based on their profile, their risk assessments, their threats and hazards that go along with that.
Mm. Yeah.
Okay. And so another question here that came up. So is there some strategy for ensuring the economic sustainability of the approach for monitoring and mapping risk and infrastructure and system protection in these complex scenarios as possible bricks of an overall solution? So using a step-by-step strategy or integration of sensing technologies from from cheaper to the more sophisticated ones, or using, for example, citizens as sensors?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not 100% sure I've understood the question itself.
Yeah. Let me possibly rephrase that, Francesco. So I guess economic sustainability in terms of the approach for monitoring and mapping the risks, especially with the infrastructure and system protection. So is there a strategy or recommendations in terms of implementations, or are you going for the, say the basic level of implementation and economic value, or do you need really top level sort of, systems and infrastructure integration in terms of your recommendations, or are you trying to, diversify those across different technologies?
Yeah, I think so. This differs across environments, so it really depends. So I think there's different tiers to our recommendations. There's recommendations that are quick wins, they can be implemented fairly quickly by the relevant authorities, and it might be something like an internal exercise on X, Y, or Z subject, to the development of regional plans and procedures. And in London, for example, we have about 25 odd capabilities looking at different consequences, and they are continuously developed. But other cities may or may not have that approach, so it depends what is relevant to them. And then there's the higher tier, which is more of a strategic level, which requires investment and ownership and buy-in over a longer period. Now, the short answer is it differs, but linking into that, this is something that I've had a couple of discussions about recently, is how we could, because at the moment a lot of this consequence-based mapping that I referred to is done manually, and that's good, because that's a process in its own right, and it's a learning process in its own right. But actually, there is scope here, I think, to utilize artificial intelligence and technology in a way in which to create systems which can identify key vulnerabilities and pinch points as part of that process. So again, it needs to be tailored for the environment, which is the key here. But if you've got X, Y, or Z city, and a system can be programmed in such a way so it understands the high level challenges that city faces in terms of its operations and population movements and so on, could a program then tell you what the key consequences could be if an incident happens in X, Y, or Z location? So in terms of that approach moving forwards, and I hope I'm not straying here, I think I'm linking back to the broader comment around that question. That could be that needs to be something that we work towards, to utilize those tools and technology in the best possible way, so that we're harnessing the benefits it can offer rather than waiting to be to feel the implications of them otherwise.
All right. Anyway, so that's probably a good time to go ahead and close out, because we're hitting about an hour anyway. But thank you, everybody, for attending and for joining us for our webinar. Stay tuned. We're going to have another webinar coming up pretty soon, and we'll send out that information as well. But Alex, thanks a lot. Appreciate you coming on the webinar series with us and explaining the work that you're doing. I think it's quite interesting and well needed.
Thank you, Kyle. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Thanks, and have a great weekend. And we'll see you in the next series.